Welcome to this late afternoon session, the Southern Hangover, Sustaining G20 Solidarity Agenda. We have been talking about G20 for some years now, particularly in the context of Indian presidency here in India, and then the handing over from India to Brazil and Brazil to South Africa. And this has been a moment to reflect upon the state of multilateralism in the world. We know that we live in fragmented times. We are reminded about it every day. We are reminded about it, but in every session that we are engaged with, this has been a consistent theme of fragmentation and disorder. And therefore, it's not surprising that multilateralism itself is the target, because whether multilateralism is working, whether it is impacting the way it should, global governance issues, and how that fragmentation of the global order is impacting multilateral institutions has been a theme of several of our conversations across the last few years. So in that context, the role for G20 becomes very interesting, because it's a plurilateral, of group of countries that bridges the developed world divide. It's a east-west, north-south divides are at least theoretically bridged in G20, and I think that has been a major contribution in these dividing times. How do you ensure that the agenda of the global South gets accepted by a wider committee of nations and therefore put firmly on the global governance map? So here we have a great slate of speakers to start the conversation. But before that, I will invite Shri Abhishek Singh, Joint Secretary MEA, and Sous-Sherpa for G20, BRICS, IBSA, amongst others, to initiate the proceedings as a scene setter. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Pant, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues and friends. We stand at a pivotal moment in the evolution of global economic governance. With the theme of solidarity, equality, sustainability, South Africa's G20 presidency marks the conclusion of an unprecedented cycle in the G20, 4 consecutive developing country presidencies that have fundamentally reframed this forum's priorities and outreach. Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa. Each nation has brought its unique perspective to the G20 while collectively amplifying the voice of Global South. The Southern Handover represents more than a procedural transition. In our view, it embodies a hope that the G20, as the premier forum for economic cooperation, will not turn away from issues and concerns of 80% of mankind residing in the developing world. The last 4 years of G20 have shown that the Global South, too, can provide leadership when the world is desperately looking for policy direction. India is proud to have contributed to this evolution of G20 during our presidency, where we successfully bridged fractious positions to achieve consensus on complex issues, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict, through the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. This achievement demonstrated the G20's continued relevance as a forum for finding common ground amid global tensions. India also led the G20 to ambitious outcomes on accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, digital public infrastructure, green development and life, women-led development, reform of multilateral institutions, and most importantly, embracing the African Union into its fold as a permanent member. During Brazil's presidency, as the Middle East conflict erupted, India again played a crucial role as a bridge builder between the disparate positions. South Africa's presidency now advances 4 priorities in the G20 that deserve our collective support. First, strengthening disaster resilience and response builds on the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group established during India's presidency. This work must continue, especially since the impacts of the climate change disproportionately affect the developing countries and the small island developing states. It is heartening to see that African presidency accords the deserved importance to this matter. Second, ensuring debt sustainability for low-income countries addresses a fundamental impediment to achieving sustainable development goals. As you are aware, with over 50 economies now spending more than 10% of public revenues on interest payments, the G20 Common Framework and the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable must finally deliver tangible outcomes. These mechanisms have not met expectations, making it imperative to develop meaningful solutions that the future G20 presidencies must carry forward. Third, mobilizing finance for just energy transition remains essential despite contentious discussions between the developed and the developing nations. India successfully advocated for scaling up climate finance from billions to trillions of dollars, and we must maintain this momentum despite disappointing outcomes at the COP29. With changing political landscapes, including the USA's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, we must find new paths forward that balance climate ambition with development needs. The reform of multilateral development banks to make them better, bigger, and more effective, as championed by India during its presidency, is another key step to mobilize affordable finance, and we hope to see the recommendations made over the last couple of years getting implemented. Fourth, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth presents an opportunity for African development while navigating complex global supply chain dynamics. This requires balanced approaches that serve both the producer and the consumer nations, a model for North-South cooperation. The three joint task forces established by South Africa focusing on inclusive economic growth, we had a meeting yesterday only on this, food security and artificial intelligence, build upon areas where developing country presidencies have demonstrated leadership. The proposed Cost of Capital Commission additionally promises to address fundamental financing challenges for developing economies. As we look towards the handover to presidencies from the global north, we face new challenges with changing political dynamics among key G20 members. Issues relating to climate action, trade, gender, and implementation of Agenda 2030 may face heightened scrutiny. However, these potential obstacles should not deter us from pursuing outcomes that benefit the global south. The successive developing country presidencies have transformed the G20 into a true bridge between the north and the south, giving economic growth and development the centrality it deserves in global economic governance. This reframing is perhaps our most important collective legacy, one that must be preserved as the baton passes to global north, starting with the United States. India stands ready to share lessons from our presidency experience and to continue our role as a bridge builder between the developed and the developing nations. Together, we can ensure that the voices of the global south remain amplified in the G20 and that multilateral cooperation prevails despite the pressure it faces from all sides. I thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Singh, for giving us an overview of India's position and also linking it up to perhaps what South Africa is trying to do. And I'll let Elizabeth speak about South African experience and South African priorities. But I think the point about G20 and the fact that we live in unprecedented times is a point that must be reiterated, because even G20 has become part of the global discourse from Washington on certain in a certain way being looked at. So how effective the G20 as a multilateral institution can be in initiating changes in areas where you do require presence of the US, where you do require North and South collaboration and cooperation. That's something we need to think about. I have 5 excellent initiators of this discussion, which means that they will be making initial remarks, and then we will open this up for your comments and observations if you have any questions that as well. So Elizabeth, over to you. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive, South African Institute for International Affairs, giving us a perspective from South Africa on South Africa's G20 presidency, its priorities, and perhaps the challenges that lie therein.
Great. Thanks, Harsh, and thanks also to Mr. Singh for actually doing a very good job of presenting the South African priorities. What I thought I would do is perhaps a little unpack some of them a little bit more, and then also focus on the challenges. I think it would be true to say that every G20 presidency tries to build on the previous one. Having said that, we also know that over the last 15 years since the G20 was elevated to a summit level, some priorities of particular countries may necessarily have fallen by the wayside or become less important, and so on and so forth. But I think we have seen over the last 4 years really a steady sort of build up on each of the priorities, whether it's in the finance track or the Sherpa track, from the Indonesians through the Indians to the Brazilians, and now to the South Africans. I think in some ways, given the geopolitical context, South Africa's agenda is quite ambitious. Mr. Singh highlighted some of the high-level priorities, and perhaps maybe a couple of years ago these might have been, so some of them might have been a little difficult, but probably not impossible to put onto the agenda and hope for some sort of outcome, at least on some of these by the end of one's presidency. I think on many of these. It will become. I think it will be quite tough to really get a concrete outcome at the end of the year, and I'll unpack that a little bit. But I think it's also important to remember that sometimes we really get obsessed about what each presidency will manage to deliver by the end of the year, and of course a joint communique is very important. But I mean, apart from that, they want to be concrete outcomes. So in the case of the Indians, the most notable is, of course, the entry of the AU into the G20. But not only that, I mean, some real progress in the discussions around MDBs and so on and so forth. The Brazilian is probably the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. But a lot of the other issues that get lost sometimes in the noise have really built one on the other. And I think certainly South Africa looks at it in those ways. In other words, there must be something that comes out that is concrete at the end of the year, but we're also building foundations for subsequent presidencies. And that may mean that some issues next year may not be on the agenda. But that I don't think is a train smash. I think one can pick them up in subsequent years. Having said that, while I'm on that topic, I do think that while there has been, we have had a rather difficult bilateral relationship with the US in the last 2 months. And I come fresh from, a very boisterous discussion in South Africa after our ambassador was declared persona non grata a couple of days ago. But nevertheless, I think there has been engagement in the G20 process. At the finance ministers' meetings, yes, we did not have the Treasury Secretary, but we had the central bank governor. We've had senior level participation from the Treasury. Yes, it was unfortunate that the Secretary of State Marco Rubio didn't come to the foreign ministers' meeting, but I mean the US is there. It's not always at the level at which it would be preferred, but it has been there, and we're hoping that this can build up going towards the summit. Just a couple of points on the priorities. I think Mr. Singh highlighted the key sort of headlines. The three task force ideas are really important, not because It's about establishing new processes. These are supposed to be time bound, but they recognize that when we have these conversations about food security, about inequality, employment, green industrialization, artificial intelligence, there are so many interconnections and so many working groups in the official tracks, both the Sherpa and the finance, actually discuss these issues. And so what you want to do is you want to bring all of these together so that you can actually get a coherent outcome. And that was really what the Brazilians were also trying to do with the task force on hunger and poverty. Apart from those 4 priorities that have already been highlighted, I want to talk a little bit about the cost of capital. It was proposed as a cost of capital commission. We're not yet sure whether that will that will be the way in which this is articulated. But the Treasury track has established an African expert panel. One of the members of which is on this at the table today, which is intended to tackle many of these issues that would have been very much part of the cost of capital. That includes, when we talk about debt more broadly, it includes the way in which the IMF does their debt sustainability assessment. It includes credit rating agencies. It includes some of the issues around regulations, around the premium, and that links back to the credit rating agencies, the premium that many African and other developing countries pay when they go to capital markets. And of course, a recognition that the way in which the debt problem we face today is very different from the debt problem we faced 20 years ago. And that in the African context, of course, in the global, if you compare the African debt numbers to global debt numbers, we're really very, very small, and we should be able to handle it. So I mean that's one set of issues. The other one, of course, which has been put on the agenda, but not quite sure how successful it will be in with an outcome, is of course WTO reform, or unparalysing, if that's a word, of the institution. Part of which relates to the appellate challenges that we face, and also making it really, putting on the agenda issues around the WTO that make it more fit for the 21st century, which includes sort of linking climate and development with the trade agenda. I think that's also quite ambitious. The other element that we see in the development working group is the illicit financial flows discussion and debate, and that's really about tackling the issue of trade mispricing and trade misinvoicing. We have the sort of stats that came out of UNCTAD a few years ago was that nearly $90 billion flow out of the African continent a year. With the aid declining, also you've got to look at plugging many of these gaps that act as hindrances to more domestic resource mobilization. So the illicit financial flows discussion is very much linked to that. Because you're probably going to tell me to shut up very soon. I think there are challenges. There are challenges that I think the South African presidency is going to face around how you build consensus in let's not kid ourselves, a really fraught environment, where issues of climate, which is very important for South Africa, and particularly finance for adaptation, not just mitigation, where we're wanting to discuss and drive country platforms and the just energy transition, where all of these are not regarded as very important among some countries. The ability to drive consensus, I think, is going to be very difficult, and it wasn't necessarily, we didn't really think about it in that context. Say a year ago, it was always Ukraine and Gaza, and now I think it's a little bit more even down to some of the technical issues. But I think so. I think it's important, and this is what came out of some of the G20 meetings over the last few weeks. It's important to emphasize the mutual and shared interests, and I think most of the people around the table, I think, are increasingly of the view that we've actually got to make this work. That what unites us is greater than what divides us, even if some countries are not necessarily going to be on the same platform as us. I think it's also for us to reflect on that on some issues, like for example on renewable energy. The way in which we make the case perhaps needs to be one that is more commercially oriented. This is not necessarily about, well, it should be about social justice, but if at the end of the day we get social and environmental justice, but if in the end of the day we get an outcome that we like using a different narrative, I think we should be open. We should be open to that. And then lastly, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes there will be limits to what we can achieve, but that doesn't necessarily in and of itself sort of mean that the process of building consensus, even if in the South African terminology it's about building sufficient consensus, we can't move some of these issues forward with a group of countries that are willing to do so.
Thank you. And I think we'll come back to several of the themes that you've touched upon, but I think this idea that that 2 or 3 or 4 years back we thought that was the worst in terms of fragmentation, but or in terms of what was happening in Washington in terms for multilateralism, that doesn't seem to go away in terms of the back that's clouding a lot of the assessments and a lot of the prognosis of a lot of themes that you have uncovered. Let me invite Hector Cardenas Suarez, President, Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, for his initiatory remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Harsh, for this opportunity. Well, I wanted just to concentrate on one aspect of the G20 process that I think is important and has been quite useful, and that is the Think 20 process, which brings together think tanks and universities from different parts of the world to create evidence-based policy briefs and a whole process of bringing sort of the knowledge and the evidence base to help the G20 decision makers make better decisions. And this was something that was started back during the Mexican presidency in 2012. My organization, Comexi, was really sort of the founder of this idea. And it's taken off. It's taken off quite well, and I'm very happy to be able to participate and work with Elizabeth on this issue, on this process. I think it's particularly valuable because it allows us to identify, the evidentiary basis of some of the initiatives that different countries have put forward. And as Elizabeth mentioned beforehand, each developing country that has had the presidency over the last 4 years have introduced new items and new issues, whether it be DPI or the fight against hunger, etc., that are important, but also have to have sort of an evidentiary basis behind them so that we can move the conversation forward. And I think that the Think 20 or T20 process has been very useful in amassing that and doing it in a way that is really quite collaborative. I think at least in the last couple of years, the way that process has been structured is that you have collaboration between think tanks in different parts of the world. And that's been incredibly productive because it's created new relationships between communities of thought that weren't necessarily in touch, or at least not as closely intertwined as before. And that is always a good thing when you're trying to salvage whatever multilateralism is left on this planet. And so as you get people who think professionally on these important topics to work together, you're creating new knowledge, and hopefully you're making it so that that knowledge can get to the decision makers and inform better decisions. Now, I think that as I observe the South Africa presidency, and this is very early moments, I see some very positive developments, at least in what relates to Think 20. And that is greater focus. I think greater focus on a smaller number of issues so that you can actually make some progress on them. And perhaps that is one of the things that might happen as we transition from the developing or the Global South presidencies to the US presidency. There may be indeed an even greater focus on a smaller number of issues as we go forward. And so it's important to start flexing that muscle of discriminating amongst the issues and trying to figure out which are the ones that are most critical and most important to work on. I think that's a very positive development as far as I can tell in the South African presidency, and I commend the way that you've organized it, because it's going to, I think it will generate some dividends if we keep working in that way. The main issues I think that are on the table right now are areas where there can be quite broad consensus, and there's a lot of evidence behind each one of them, whether we're talking about climate change related issues and energy transition or digital transformation. There's a lot of work that's being done in different parts of the world, and all of that is coming together in the Think 20, and that's a very positive development. So I'm quite optimistic about the short term. I think that we can get some stuff done. And we can get some interesting ideas out to the decision makers. In the long term, it's going to be a harder road. I think there's going to have to be a lot of negotiating and a lot of work done in good faith between parties that maybe don't agree on many important things. But that, I think, is the role of us as think tanks, as places where people come to think together and to disagree together, and then hopefully to find some measure of consensus around some basic ideas that we can all fall behind. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. I think the focus on T20 is particularly welcome, because, of course, all of us work so hard in so many of these working groups, hoping that it would have an impact. So the fact that you have recognized that is wonderful, and I do think that it makes a difference in terms of epistemic communities being created that can, despite the disruption that happens in the track 1 world, if in the track 2, as you said, if there is enough consensus, and it becomes very difficult to ignore that. But I'm slightly surprised by your optimism for short term and pessimism for long term, because I thought it would be the other way around. That short term, and we'll come to the American response, but that's a very positive and Mexican outlook on things. Yes, very. So let me invite Katie Daroca Gomez from Brazil, Director, Institute for Applied Economic Research, for her comments as initiator.
Thank you, Cher, very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start. I'd like to start saying that it's a pleasure for me to participate in this thought-provocative roundtable, where we discuss the perspective for the G20 and the possibilities of the continuity of the agenda focused on promoting solidarity among and with countries. Especially come back to a table when we are discussing G20 after having followed the Brazil working on financial track last year. So I'm going to move to a different direction, talking about general guidelines on idea of G20, especially related with global thought. Presidencies. The emergence of this agenda centered on promoting solidarity is a clear result of the work carried out over the last 4 G20 presidents, and I'm including also the Thought Africa now. So 4 G20 presidents held by developing countries, and these have progressively led to significant changes in the group's priorities. This change have placed to the forefront issues and perspectives that were harder addressed in the most important international forums. They brought to the debate the aim to tackle inequality within and between countries, and while addressing climate change emergency and promoting financial improvements to support a just energy transition. Put inequality in the center of international economic debate seems something easy or something that could bring a huge support, but in the reality we have a lot of difficulty to put inequality in the center of the agenda. And this was particularly reinforced in G20 by Brazil last year, after appearing in 2022 and 2023, and is clearly reflect now in the priorities of the South Africa presidency. It's important to note that at the same time that this priority express developing country concerns, they also invite us to have a broad and systemic way to think and address global problems, and a collaborative approach between North and South to find global solutions. For this reason, I think that G20 plays a definitive central role by gathering different voices and perspectives to the same table in an effort to make them an increasing key part of the debate at the global level. It's also important to consider that developing countries' concerns during the last G20 presidency, although related to the specific reality of these nations, impact the lives of countries that are home to most of the planet population, which make the challenge they pose to policy making absolutely central to our economies, with systemic implication for global social sustainability. This focus naturally shift the scope necessary for global economic governance. Unfortunately, I need to remark that the continuity of this effort is not guaranteed in the upcoming years. This because developed countries are historically less affected by the issues highlighted in the last 4 G20 presidents, leading to the risk that these concerns may no longer be well incorporated in G20 debates. This, however, is not necessarily the only possible outcomes, and is certainly not not a desirable one. Resume the issue of systemic implication. One way to avoid this setback could be to frame the priorities and concerns of the global south within the broader context of addressing global inequalities. Addressing global inequality implies and invites us to fix systemic and address a systemic solution. Inequality, especially when high, rising, and persistent, restricts economic growth by limiting the potential for demand expansion and increase in productivity, while also threatening the political and social stability in countries. Of course, inequality and its negative consequences are especially evident in this global south, but a less unequal world, both within among countries, is going to be a better world for everyone. To advance in this direction requires active collaboration in the interest of common goods. This is why solidarity among people and the idea that there are no individual solutions to global problems are so crucial. This mission may seem more difficult in a world that witnessed more unilateral decision and where the multilateralism has been increasing challenge. Even by governments and interested groups and the parts of the society in countries that over the past decades have strongly defended a more integrated world. Indeed, it's more difficult, but I think that policy initiatives that led to a less unequal and more solidarity-driven world, as expressed in the priorities of South African presidents, certainly have a place in this process. To advance then, analysis and debate are more necessary than ever, which is why I am grateful for essential initiative like this Raisina Dialogue Conference, to which I'm especially pleased to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gigi. I think interesting point about addressing, looking at global South issues through a broader spectrum in terms of global inequality can perhaps lead to a different set of conversations between the developing and developed and the developing countries. But I think for that we need to go to the US for Marcus Brunheimer, professor at Princeton University, and his take on what is happening in the G20 space, perhaps, and what is happening in the US and how it looks at the G20, given the presidencies coming to the US, which it may not be very willing to take on.
Yes. So I should, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be part of this panel. I have to first say that I'm an academic. I'm not part of the government or the administration, and I'm actually a German citizen, so I'm part of the North, but I cannot speak for the US administration. And hence, I will try to step back a little bit and give a broader perspective, an academic perspective. I think, of course, as we all know, we're shifting away from a multilateral rule-based world order to a more bilateral transactional world order. And that has huge challenges coming up. And there's challenges where it's uncertain where we're going, essentially, in the long run. But there will be a transition phase. And the transition phase has to be, accompanied with some policy measures. And any transition will come with disruptions and challenges. And the question is how to manage this transition in the most resilient way. There's a danger that, when you move from one system to a new system, it comes with a different way. It could be that in the end, the world will be more multipolar and a different outcome. So I can see very different long-run outcomes from the world governance perspective. But the G20 can take an important role in the transition phase, also to make the transition very resilient, so that there's the danger of derailing is minimized. I leave it at this, not very concrete, but I think that would be one important element for the G20. Now, one long-run outcome would be that we stay in the long run very much in a transactional world order, and there might be a multipolar world, and there are typically 5 poles emerging in a multipolar world. I can go into it. It's the underlying theory of why there are 5 poles might be emerging. And then it will be more challenging what the G20 whether it will be a very prominent role in the world order. But one thing, if we move to such a world, it will be squeezing small countries. So the large countries, they will have enough bargaining power, essentially. Different poles, including India as one pole, will have, will be in a good position. But smaller countries will be much more at their disadvantage. And then institutions like the World Bank or the IMF could then take on a role to be the champions of the smaller countries, because they need some champions essentially too. It could also be that India takes on some role as a champion for the small countries, especially of the global south, or it could be a group of countries in the global south. I think that's would be one thing. Of course, the alternative is that we go back to a new rule-based order, which might be more globally, more well-balanced compared to what it is now. That would be a better outcome. And again, then G20 would play a much more important role in this outcome. And then, of course, the IMF and the World Bank and all the institutions would play a more balanced role between the North and the South. So that's the first point I wanted to make. I want to make 3 points. The second point is, of course, we live in a world of fragmentation. So there's US, there's China, and the world is fragmenting. I would argue for double fragmentation. So if we'll have to live in a world with fragmentation, it would be good to have double fragmentation. So if the world is fragmented, let's at least also fragment the topics. And there are certain topics where we don't have to fragment and have perhaps approach it still at a world perspective. So that should be handled globally. Of course, certain challenges are very global. Think of climate change or AI safety regulation and all these things. And many of these topics were mentioned before. And the hope is to fragment the topics and keep this as well. And finally, I would like to go a little bit in global finance. It came already up that the debt restructuring initiatives of the Catholic Church is this Jubilee year. They're trying very hard this year to get something going on the debt restructuring, also for the poorest countries of the world. I would like to highlight another thing which is very important. There's on the one hand, there's US dollar, which has a dominant position. On the other hand, there's also the global safe asset that, like the US Treasury, is the global safe asset. Whenever there is some crisis in the world, funds flow out of the emerging economies from the global south to the US Treasury. And this essentially gives the US an exorbitant privilege, which means that in crisis times, it can issue government bonds at very good conditions. And in good times, things are also beneficial, but especially in crisis times. So the covariance between crisis times and funding conditions is this way. So essentially, we have currently a global financial architecture where the poor insure the rich. So essentially, the poor countries insuring the rich countries. And not only is there baseline exorbitant privilege, but this co-movement is actually designed in such a way. There's a second order exorbitant privilege, which is even more quantitative important. And, there's one way to, the underlying problem is that the global safe asset is actually provided by the United States, to some extent also by the German Bund and the Japanese government bonds. These assets provide the global safe asset basket, the reserve assets. And typically the way the South deals with it holds huge reserve holdings at a very low interest rate. The question is, how can we design the global financial architecture which is more balanced? And one way to design it would be for the South to also be able to issue safe assets. And I can't go into the details, but there's a certain approach you can do this. You could pool several government bonds from the global South, and then by pooling, you diversify some of this risk, and then you tranche it in a senior bond and in a junior bond. And the senior bond would be very safe, because if some of the southern countries have to default, go to some debt restructuring, it will hit the junior bond first. So the junior bond is absorbing the risk, but the senior bond is only touched after the junior bond is wiped out. So you have a protection from the junior bond. And the senior bond would be extremely safe because it's protected from the junior bond. And this way, the senior bond would be a safe asset as well. So the current world order, the financial order, is this way, that whenever there's a crisis, a global crisis, there's a flight to safety into US treasuries. So it's a cross-border flight to safety. In such a new arrangement, there would still be flight to safety at a smaller scale, but a large part of this flight to safety would be then from the junior bond of the global south to the senior bond of the global south. So it's not cross-border flight to safety anymore. It's flight to safety across asset classes. So you rechannel essentially the flight to safety capital flows. And this way you can stabilize the whole global financial architecture. So that's one way, which is, proposal. You can look at it. It's a proposal which doesn't need any intervention by some government officials or some G20. It is automatically stabilizing because the flight to safeties are rechanneled if you set it up the right way. That would be one way to, get them more, to reduce the capital flows that are associated with crisis. So overall, I think we're in a difficult transition period. We're coming back to the first point. And the challenge will be to really manage this in a very resilient way. And that requires for everybody, including the G20, to be very agile, very adaptive, and adjust to new circumstances, because the world will be erratic in the next few years. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Marcus. Very interesting idea about global financial architecture reforms there. I hope this comes through during the American presidency and then a big part of America's presidency agenda. Let me now, final speaker, Riatu Mariatul Kiptia Director, Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia. And it all started from Indonesia. So we are. It's Kal Chakra, the circle is back to Indonesia. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pan. Yeah, I think in the context of G20 house countries, we have sequential for developing countries, but actually before that is actually already like Saudi Arabia and Indonesia is we are from we become host from Italy. And still, even between the developing and developed countries, there are also aligned interests in terms of the issues, especially from Saudi, like what I follow from Saudi, Italy, Indonesia, and India, and Brazil, and now South Africa. Then I think this context of global common goods is not about sustainability, about the context of inequality and growth, and also in terms of digital divide, context of debt and debt sustainability, even in the but in this case, the G20 as the fora from, I think, is quite effective to give directive and guidance to multilateral, and it gives legitimacy also that it represents not only like developed countries but also coordination with developing countries. In the case of, for example, going back to Saudi Arabia, we have crisis unexpected when we started the G20 process, like COVID-19, and it's even like changing what is actually the most pressing problems at the time. And also in terms of, although we also align with domestic priorities, it needs to also become part of all the parties as well, all member countries. And I just discussed with Elizabeth as well. In the context of Indonesia, even in the process, we don't think that G20 will feel, given the war of Ukraine and Russia, there is question whether there is still a G20 at the time. And we just think that maybe if there is even a summit is already an achievement. And in fact, the members of countries, the Troika itself, India also has helped the Indonesia, and before also Italy is quite strong in moving forward the agenda at the time. And surprisingly also that it is not only that it come together until the end, but also there are achievements in the process itself. And I think the best thing also in the context of G20 is not only policymakers, and it's not only the policymakers like Hector said, it's also more inclusive process. It also there are also engagement groups like Think 20 that created under Mexico presidency, and the other also engagement group like private firms, business, B20, and also in the case of Indonesia, for example, we also think of accountability needs to be addressed. So there is also Supreme Audit Agency that actually supported by the US as well. And that, I think, showing up in that not only on the context of financial stability, but also on the development agenda. And the involvement of this engagement group maybe can also smoothing if there are like, halting process or some challenges in terms of the policymakers of government finance or Sherpa track. And I think the context of Brazil is also already showing that these unity collaborations, not only within the government, but also with other parties, is also improving the policy making at the developed countries, especially because like what you say, Hector's, we need more policy making that is based on evidence-based policies. And given that improvement in the institution may not be captured by developed countries, we have different challenges, and discussions among developing countries is also very much needed in the detail, even following up on that. And in that sense, that the context of multilateral and the regional on following up of commitments that being drafting in various track, even under the engagement group, I think is also important. It will not be disappear. Multilateralism, I think, will still be needed. It is a standard. What we know that it is good or bad without the standard or the rules of that. So, for example, in the context of the even domestic resource mobilization, we don't know like how to compare between one country, the good one, or still suboptimal. If there is no disclosure on that information, there is no standard. And I think this organizations, multilateralism still hold, and it is needed as a public good. Thank you.
Thank you, Riyatu, for your comments. Now I have only 10 minutes with me, so I'll open this up for your questions, comments, observations. Please raise your hand so that I can see who all want. So I have. Okay, so all around the room I have people. Sir, over to you.
After Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, number one, will there be a G20 in 2026? And following up on the chairman's comments, how will the G20 be in 2026 if there is one?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and then I think we will have some insights into this. Yes, yes. Go ahead, please.
I'm Ruchita Berry from Vivekananda International Foundation. Elizabeth, you talked about South African presidency. Is this the last chance for G20, especially the Global South, for pushing forward their development agenda? You talked about various development priorities. So do you think it's the last chance, or as Marcus says, we are moving towards a transactional world order? Do you think there will be any chance of the Global South pushing for this in future? Yeah.
Elizabeth, it would be an interesting exercise to think what kind of transactions you could do between the institutions that we are, G20 and then the rest of the world, perhaps, or specifically one country. There's someone here, yes.
Loka Nyonyar, Tabombeki Foundation. My question really built on these two initial ones. If you think about the whole host of communiques that have come out, say, since 2007, the last of the finance minister meetings, there are many recommendations that sit in all of these documents. What we haven't truly grappled with enough in the G20 ecosystem, and more so as we move towards a world that may not even have a G20 or may have a G20 in a very different guise moving forward, is how do we grapple with the question of this Chekhovian gun that's been sitting there ready to shoot? We've been talking reform for a long time, but none of us are actually truly committed to converting these documents into real action. And so, if anything, the South African presidency is in one part in a very ambitious manner an opportunity to finally commit to action. But the context we're in suggests that no action is possible. And so this is no real question, but really a rant about where we find ourselves at the moment.
Yes, I think we live in a time when ranting is very important. So please rant. And I'll come. Yes, I think there was a lady here.
Thank you. I am Ashlim from the ECB Sustainable Youth Foundation. My question is to the panel that the IMF projects that geoeconomic fragmentation will reduce the global GDP by 7% in the long term. Now, what role should the G20 play in mitigating the risks of economic decoupling between major economies while also ensuring a fairer global trade system? Thank you.
Yeah, we are getting one big question after another. So, yes.
My question is, with all the global tensions that arises, the economic crisis and the geopolitical tensions that are rising, can G20 still unite the global north and south, or is it just becoming another divided platform?
Yeah, my question is simple. Somebody raised the issue of equality in the context of the North-South relations, but shouldn't both North and South countries be talking about the internal equality first before talking about the interstate equality? Thank you.
Good evening to all. I'm Lata Sharma. And my question is, given the current global environment, where developed countries like the USA appear to favor bilateralism over multilateralism, how do you foresee the sustainability of multilateralism in the form of G20? As highlighted by a US delegate in the previous session, this shift raises concern about the sustainability of multilateralism and its role in global cooperation. So what do you think? Where does this shift will take this challenge forward? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Rahul Mishra from Center for Indo-Pacific Studies, JNU. My question is, if we cut, and pardon me for saying this, if we cut the rhetorical clutter of G20 and just focus on this one idea that G20 is acting or aims to act as a bridge, the flow of information, of technology, of resources, all of it is unilateral. It's just one-sided. And my sense is that unless that is going to change, G20 is not going to be the most important multilateral institution. So my question is, on questions of critical technology, artificial intelligence, what is it that G20 is doing to first to act as a bridge, and second to make sure that technology is transferred, that is, and second that Global South also plays a role?
Within current day United States, and I live in Hawaii, another once independent nation within the United States. Curious if the G20 will consider nation within nations membership in the future.
Thank you, Professor Pant, and thank you to all the delegates for their questions. I think 8 or 9 questions, very diverse question, but the common theme in some of the question was, reminds me of a discussion that I attended a few days back, and the title of that was "Wither G20." Wither. So I think, in my personal view, whatever little I have, dealt with the G20, so these are very premature, I would say, observation right now when people are questioning the efforts of much more than a decade of countries from the global north and the global south coming together and coming out with some very tangible outcomes. So definitely there will be a G20 in 2026 and much beyond that. So that was the first question. And how will be that 2026 G20 presidency? Difficult to say at this stage, but every presidency sets the agenda, sets the priorities, and it is for all the other G20 members to come across and find that common ground, and they have always succeeded. And if you recall the Indian G20 presidency, when we were working on the negotiations for the leaders declaration, it was very ambitious, but still we could find the common ground. I mean, the global north countries were there, and global south countries were there. There were divergent viewpoints, but we could still come on, some common ground, some common landings. So I'm sure 2026 will be no different. There will be differences, but there will be, areas where, all the countries will come together And the important, themes of the discussion will also continue in one way or the other. We cannot expect a G20 where we'll not talk about sustainable development goals. We'll talk about trade imbalance. We'll talk about promoting digital public infrastructure. Yes, some views are coming of certain nations. Every country is entitled for its views, but how it will come together is will be an act of diplomacy, and I'm sure finally diplomacy will prevail. Somebody mentioned about the last opportunity. Again, it is some kind of a doomsday scenario. I don't agree with that. It's not a last opportunity for developing countries. It's not like it's developing countries versus the developed countries. It's always, when we talk about India as being the bridge builder, it's also not a rhetorical clutter, as somebody mentioned. It is, we have seen G20s evolve, G20 presidencies evolve, and India has played that role. There are views, some very strong views on issues that, divide us. But there are, ways to overcome the differences, and we will, of course, find the common ground. On economic decoupling, I think I'll leave it to Marcus to probably respond to that. Fair global trade will be something which will be an important theme for all presidencies. It is definitely there for the South African, and it was for India, and so I'm sure it will be there for the future also, future presidencies. Another aspect that was, asked about was whether, the so-called preference of US for bilateralism over multilateralism. I mean, we had a meeting I shared with Professor Pant yesterday, and the US delegation was there and participated in all the three segments. So let's, wait and watch and then come to a firm conclusion as to, whether there's a preference for bilateralism or multilateralism. Every country, I'm sure every country of G20 has, strong preference for bilateralism as well as multilateralism also. So let's not come to conclusions so quickly. I would rather wait for a while and see, how things evolve. But my optimism is very clear that there will be enough space for multilateralism as there will be space for bilateralism. So there are many questions. I want other panelists also to respond to that. Maybe. Thank you.
Since the time is up, I'll request all the panelists to be brief and crisp in their responses. So Elizabeth, I'll start with
you. On the sort of, is this the last chance for the Global South? I don't think so. So I would agree there with Mr. Singh, partly because, as I said, a lot of this is, you put things on the agenda and then you build up, and you may not build up at the same pace every time, but you create the foundation. The other point I want to make is that I think that we still have to realize the concrete elements of it, but I think there is greater push and a recognition also from many countries in the global north that there have to be reforms. Okay, now I think we're still very much at the rhetorical level on a number of these, but I think in this environment where order is shifting, where rules are changing, I think those countries that are committed to multilateralism also, I think, are beginning to recognize that if they themselves don't start pushing beyond the rhetoric, this order may be a very different one from the one that would serve many countries that are not great powers. And so I'm hoping that and we have a role to play also as think tanks in sort of pushing and creating platforms for that kind of debate. The other point I just want to make to Lucanio's frustration, I think that's one of the points that, of course, South Africa has put on the agenda as a priority, which we forgot to mention, is the review of the G20 since it became a head of state meeting. I think there are a lot of commitments made. And obviously, the G20 itself is an informal grouping. It doesn't implement. It depends on each country's desire to drive forward change. But there have been, I think, some developments, particularly in the international financial institutions, which, have built up some incremental changes. Not enough and not quickly enough. But it does mean that these things can happen but it needs greater accountability, and hopefully there'll be something concrete coming out of the review that countries can take forward.
I think it's early to tell if there's going to be a G20 in 2026, at least the way that we've experienced it in the past. And I think that this will very much depend on to what degree the US government sees a use in the G20. If it's useful to them to resolve a specific issue or a set of specific issues, I think then they will engage, and there will be work that will be done that might be productive. I think that even with all of the bluster and all of the rhetorical excesses of the Trump administration, there's an underlying pragmatism and a desire to make deals and to make arrangements. And let's not forget, the G20 came out of necessity. It didn't come out of goodwill and just everybody wanting to get together and sing Kumbaya. It was about resolving a deep, deep economic crisis that affected the whole world. And when the United States and some of the main powers in Europe saw that they needed a coordinated response, that's how the G20 was born. And so, yes, later on, there's been stuff added onto it because other countries wanted something also, and so it's become bigger and it's become more, I'd say, more ambitious in some ways. But also, perhaps this is the moment where it'll become pared down a little bit. Maybe the 2026 G20 is a pared down G20 that is looking at a smaller number of issues that have a specific benefit to the main player, and that the other players are willing to say, okay, well, this isn't exactly what we want, but we'll go along and get something done, and then we'll see what happens next year. Thank you.
I think that G20 is a space when you share ideas, guidelines, thoughts, aspiration, hope, and discuss this not so real but subjective topics is very important when you are trying to build a better world, when you're trying to address a common challenge and a common problems. So, I mean, I was thinking about your question because this was my question when I started to work with G20, and but I think that the idea discussed under this group is also have the power to be behind the design of public policies in many countries. And also when you have a moment like now, when I see some challenge on to build a more integrated world, when we have the risk of fragmentation, as many people here raise this topic, we have a huge debate, a common sense, not so common, but some ideas shared, and it works as a barrier to face this kind of what I said setback. In this way, I think that in 2026 we are unfortunately going to see some setbacks, some ideas like inequality, climate change, and especially issue when it requires more coordination. But the better news, I say that it's not for a long time, because the issue discussed in the G20 group are so important to be forgotten. I think it's the crucial message. Thank you.
Yeah, I will make it short given the time. So I have 2 points, whether the G20 will remain or not. I hope it will, but I think one has to probably rethink the governance. I can imagine some presidencies, it's very presidency dependent. If 2-3 presidencies don't care about G20, it will fade away. So we might want to think about a different, perhaps a troika arrangement for presidency taking over, so to overcome such a hurdle. And the other important point is to make it relevant or keep it relevant, to focus on the core global issues, which everybody has an interest to be part of it.
Yeah, I think in terms of the issue is unaccumulated, so it's already taking out also as well by the regional, the multilateral. So even if there is change, the fora of G20 becomes smaller or changes in the institutions. What have been done before is already following up by each member of countries, even in the context of Indonesia, commitment in the G20, what come from the G20 2022 is actually following up as the also part of the priorities in ASEAN the next year. So I think every country has also their interest to preserve that. So and going with the other multilateral context as well as bilateral, this is part of the spillover that will not diminish at all at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think it's a good point to end this conversation on, which is, I think, way more positive and optimistic than perhaps some of the conversations outside. So in this room, at least, we continue to converge on the salience of platform like G20, and perhaps this idea that we need some institutional frameworks, formal or informal does not matter, but maybe the informality of G20 and the way it emerged in a certain context allows it to continue its longevity for the foreseeable future. So thank you all for joining this afternoon, and thank you all to all the panelists. Thank you.